Well, thanks everyone for coming out today, and thanks for everybody who helped me get ready to give this talk. So I read earlier the Heart Sutra, and on first hearing, it's very hard to make any sense of it, and probably on the 100th hearing, it's hard to make any sense of it. It's a very difficult philosophical sutra. It is one that's often chanted in at least Zen Buddhist sanghas. And I remember one of the times we were chanting it in the sangha that I attend in Chicago. And then later during the discussion, one of the people there who's actually a monk said, and when we chant this sutra, we're not thinking about it philosophically. And I thought, oh crap, because number one, it's hard for me to not do that, and number two, it's very philosophical, and it's very strange. It's a crazy sutra in a way because it says there's neither this nor that nor the other thing, and everything is emptiness in the end, except it's not even emptiness in a way. And so sometimes this sutra is called not just the Heart Sutra, and the word heart in it really refers to this idea of prajna paramita, of the heart of wisdom. What is the core of wisdom? Some say, really the earliest versions of this sutra we have go back to about the 8th century CE. It's of, shall we say, difficult provenance, but some claim that it was one of the last sermons preached by the Buddha, and they sometimes call it the Heart Attack Sutra because it's so radical that it's said that even some of Buddha's closest followers, so-called arhats, who are Buddhas in their own right, are realized beings in their own right, just fell down dead upon hearing this sutra because it was so radical. So I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and I think it's an extremely interesting piece. And I did want to say, too, just by way of introduction, that I really liked what Willow said, because I think in a certain sense, the thing that makes Buddhism different from other, whatever it is, religion, thought system, belief system, commitment, is that it really does have this idea that there is the possibility of change. In fact, there's the necessity, and there's in a way the permanence of change. There's no permanence except for change. And the idea there is that there's no essence that we're trying to get back to. There's nothing that we're trying to get back to. There's no essence at the end of things that's pulling us. Everything is change. And in a certain sense, to make sense of Buddhism is simply to make sense of that one idea of impermanence, of there always being change, of there never being anything that just is permanent and is always the same. In other words, you could say it's to make sense of this idea of emptiness, and I'll come back to that. So the other day I was telling someone about this talk, and I said that a good many years ago I had given a talk here in this room in which I was quite critical of Buddhism. And the other person asked if I was still critical, and I said, no, now I am a Buddhist. And the thing is, I still hold to some of the reasons that I was critical of Buddhism in the past. In philosophical terms, this to me has to do with what I find to be the most intractable and difficult question in Buddhism, philosophically speaking, which is the relationship between the idea of emptiness and the idea of compassion, or not just the idea of compassion, but the practice of compassion. So what is Buddhism? And that's a difficult question, and every question I'm going to raise here I think is so difficult that we could spend a long time talking about it, and we don't have that time. But I don't know if it's more difficult than the question, for example, what is Christianity? I suppose, though, with Buddhism, there's that extra question. There's always that extra question, whether it's a religion or perhaps something else, perhaps a philosophy. But what is a religion? And that one's not an easy question either. And I often find that a lot of the people who are talking large in society today, especially kind of the what are sometimes called the four horsemen of the apocalypse and the new atheism, the two D's and the two H's. I'm trying to remember that. Dennett, Dawkins, Hitchens, and what's the other guy? Christopher Harris. Yeah. That they'll go on and on about religion and never define religion, and part of the problem there is that it's very difficult to define. And they tend to not really know much more about what they're really talking about than anybody else when you get down to that point here. So the more direct prod to talking today was the fact that when Dee Boyd, my great friend, did her exhibition on the history of this particular Unitarian Universalist fellowship, she included the article that was about the talk I had given before. And I find that talk now, and in a way maybe this is always the case if you're trying to develop as a thinker and as a philosopher, but I find that talk now a little bit, shall we say, embarrassing, some of the things I said, also because I often shoot my mouth off without really knowing what I'm talking about. And so when I saw that article right on that panel over there, and rereading it, I thought, well, maybe 16 years later, it's time to sort of give a rebuttal to the talk I gave previously. Although, really, the core of what I was saying then was that one of my worries about Buddhism is that in the West, it seems attractive to people who are, in a way, trying to flee from history, flee from personal political commitments, and it's very interesting to me that about the same time I was developing these ideas, a fairly well-known philosopher, some of you may have heard of him, he's actually kind of famous, at least in the world of intellectuals, named Slavoj Žižek, who's from Slovenia, was starting to talk about this idea that if Max Weber were to write his famous book today, what is that? The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he would instead call it the Western Buddhist Ethic and the Spirit of Global Capitalism. And he was making these arguments that there is a kind of attempt to escape from history in the appeal, especially of these ideas for Westerners. And that's what I was more critical of, but I wasn't really seeing a much larger picture. And the funny thing is, and I'll just compress a lot of what I wanted to say just in this one sentence. I grew up a nice Christian boy, and I was very committed to it. And in fact, until I was a senior in high school, I wanted to be a minister in the Methodist Church. And then, for various reasons, I moved away from that. But there was a sense in which I studied Buddhism. I studied Buddhism from a fairly early age. I was very interested in it when I was really around 14, 15 years old. I began to get interested in this. I was interested in it in part because it's so different from everything that I believed as a Christian. Seemingly radically different, but I also knew that tens and even hundreds of millions of people adhered to this faith. And so I just wondered what that was all about. And in fact, one thing in the paper that I probably won't read is that I used to belong to a group called Youth for Christ when I was in junior high and high school, and I would go to meetings, and one of the appeals for it for me was that growing up in Miami, Florida, a lot of our activities when we would do more recreational activities were on the water, and that meant that there was the possibility of seeing teenage girls in swimsuits, and so that was more of a draw than the actual Christianity part of it. But then on the other hand, because I was very sensitive and often embarrassed for myself to be seen in a swimsuit, I would sometimes say be on the boat instead of actually doing the water skiing or whatnot. And one time I was talking with the guy who was the adult leader, who was also had the boat, And I said, well, I've been reading some books about some of these fringe types of Christianity, such as the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science, etc. And then I said, and I've also been reading a book about Buddhism. And I guess I thought, and this kind of goes to a big part of my whole thinking here, I guess I thought, given that this was still the 60s, really, that this adult leader would sort of respond in the spirit of, well, that's great. I mean, it's great to learn about what different people think. I mean, that's really what I was expecting. And of course, I was extraordinarily naive because instead I received sort of a stern warning to just not go anywhere near any of that stuff. And of course, it's still true today that if you tell a teenager to not check things out, then that's going to be, the most appealing thing. But what I was going to say, to sum up in one sentence, it's sort of like Freud saying that the country that was most resistant to psychoanalysis would later embrace it most strongly, and in America, I think growing up, I was very resistant to Buddhism, and I was resistant to it for a long time. And then now I've embraced it. Now I've embraced it for going on 5 years. And so the dynamic of that is really what I wanted to talk a little bit about. And I'll just kind of compress it a little bit because I want to hear what other people have to say too. So I left organized Christianity when I was 17 years old at the beginning of my senior year of high school, and this had to do with the fact that the church that I had joined was one where the ministers were influenced by liberation theology, and they were militant opponents of the Vietnam War, and they were militant advocates for justice across a very broad spectrum. They were very inspired people. But unfortunately, the church I joined really exploded over this, and in fact, I was there on the day when it truly did explode, on Sunday, right at the end of the summer, when I was 17, just before my senior year. And this again was in Miami. It was very hot. And in fact, for some reason, it was very hot inside the church, and it was packed. And I wasn't going to tell the story, but I'll just tell it very quickly. The ministers had been in Washington, D.C. at a very large protest march against the war, and they came back and preached very fiery sermons against the war, and even to the point where they both preached. And when the assistant minister preached, there was a point in the middle of the sermon, and this was the point when the whole church exploded, where he literally banged his fist on the pulpit, and he said, "And God damn it, they have to end that war." And certainly you could have heard a pin drop at that point. And from that point on, the church literally just came apart because half the people very much agreed with that, and half the people very much disagreed with it. And interestingly, sort of the class dynamic of the church, the people who disagreed were also the better off sort of middle and upper middle class people, and who put out a lot of money for the church, and so were able to make certain decisions. And that was it for me for a while, and now I'm going to compress a lot more. So I left the organized Christianity. I just was fed up with it as it became sort of a hate and war church instead of a love and peace church. And I gravitated toward Marx and Marxism. I read tons of Marx in college and began to be part of organized Marxist movements, and then ultimately became a part of organized Maoist movement, which I was a part of for 25 years. And but one of the things I didn't really think about all through that very much, I mean, there were times where, as anyone reading Marx will do, and anybody following this out will do, they will see that behind Marx is a scheme, a kind of scheme of understanding history that's not very different from Christianity. And there are even times when Marx and Engels will describe it that way, that there's an earlier state of an unoppressive communal society, then society falls, there's a fall, it falls into a long, long, long period that we're still in of class oppression, and then ultimately that gets resolved, and then we again have a new kind of communal society. I mean, this is a Christian story, essentially, and many people many people noticed that, and I still believed in it myself, and I believed in it in the sense of, of history, in a certain sense, with a capital H, replacing the notion of God. And I still find this very appealing, I should say. I do find it appealing, what I think in a way is the central message of Christianity, that there's a kind of redemptive logic underlying the development of history. I find it appealing, but in a way, and this is a difficult philosophical problem we could talk about, I don't believe in it. I find it appealing, but I can't any longer believe in it. I don't any longer believe that there is an underlying logic to things. What I think is underlying is impermanence and change and contingency. In other words, I don't think anything's unfolding according to some necessity. But what brought me to that point? So in a certain sense, after being a kind of Western monotheistic Christian Marxist and even Maoist for 25, 26 years, some things happened about 5 years ago. And some of them are personal and some of them are larger. For one thing, the politics that I was a part of finally reached a point where it was rethinking some things and thinking that, well, gee, you know, Marx and Lenin and Mao, they're great and everything, but these guys have been gone for a long time now. And how much they have to do with how we understand things in the world and how things might change in the world, and how much they really even had to do with how things changed in the world in their own time, is something that we really need to seriously revisit. But this meant, of course, that movements that I was a part of, groups that I was a part of, were coming apart. It was really like an ugly divorce, frankly, a lot of this kind of stuff. So that was one thing. That was a very big thing. Another thing was that a major thinker began to appear on the horizon, already a bit on the horizon in France, but now on a more global scale, named Alain Badiou. I think we'll get to a picture of him eventually. I had asked Bart to just sort of put up his pictures just for the heck of it, so you'd have something to look at, other than me, I suppose. And there's the great Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, a big part of my life, a huge part of my life, looking to them. On the other hand, not smoking. Those guys, along with Hannah Arendt, man, they could smoke some cigarettes. Yeah. One of the things I actually put in the paper that I didn't mention was that, I mean, a very big thing in my life, and maybe for some others here, and I heard this said on the radio again the other day, recording with Muhammad Ali, back in 1963, 64, when he said that no Vietnamese ever called me nigger. This was an incredible moment, and even as a little boy, this had a big effect on me. I mean, it really made me wonder, well, what is he talking about, and made me want to understand that. And really, in the background of all of this is the Vietnam War, and even those points in high school when I was beginning to have arguments with my father about, well, what are you going to do when you get drafted, that sort of thing. And I missed it by about 1 year, pretty much exactly 1 year. But I was getting close enough to where my father was asking me these questions, and we were arguing about it quite a lot, like Panther Party. So this thinker appeared on the horizon named Alain Badiou, who was working out some of these same problems in a certain sense of what is a post-Maoist way of understanding the world, and looking in a certain sense at the last revolution and asking, what will the next revolution be? What kinds of things are coming? And interestingly, having this strange intersection with Buddhism, which Mao also had, although in a different way. So, two things I was thinking about. One is that Mao, as the leader of this immense revolution in China, and I'll just say here, just for brevity's sake, for better or for worse, but certainly an immense revolution, Mao was the only major Marxist leader or a theoretician who was not raised and did not speak to the Western monotheistic tradition. To the extent that he had any Western monotheism in it, it was just that which came through Marx and Lenin, you might say. But he was raised actually a Buddhist, and his mother was a very devout Buddhist, and he grew up going to the temple every week. And if you read Mao that way, you can see that he says many things that are either Buddhist or at least you might say anti-Confucian, which on the whole I think Buddhism is anti-Confucian and egalitarian. And clearly, equality was, in a certain sense, the leading theme of what Mao was about. From another angle, Badiou also argues very strongly for the idea that every revolution has to have equality as its central theme, but also that the basis of that, and this is different from Mao, for Badiou, who's still alive now, he was born in 1937, a very active figure still, for Badiou, the basis of everything is nothing. And so the basis of everything is mathematics, but the basis of mathematics is the empty set. And so this is very complicated stuff philosophically, but it comes back around to this idea of emptiness. And so all of that was sort of coming together for me. But then the other thing that happened 5 years ago is I had what I called the year of living stupidly, which is that where a lot of things were falling apart, the Maoist movement that I had been a part of was coming apart. And then my own life was coming apart in the spring of 2011, and I was going through what I really understand now in Buddhist terms, and this was again an attraction of Buddhism for me, is a kind of crisis of attachment. I was very much just attached to certain things that I just couldn't let go of. And I think Buddhism can also even be understood as letting go practice and emptiness practice. And so, but in the middle of that period, I couldn't see any of that. Even my friends who were telling me, well, you should meditate, you should try meditating. Unfortunately, none of them meditated, the ones who were telling me that. So they really didn't tell me much about it. I mean, even ones who thought of themselves as Buddhists, they didn't meditate. And so, they weren't really helping me that much by telling me that I should meditate, because they weren't really showing me how. And when I thought about what I thought meditation was, it wasn't really working for me. So this is a whole other chapter. Well, then I came home for the summer. I was in Chicago, more or less going out of my mind in the winter and spring of 2011. I came home for the summer. I was able to spend the summer with my dear, beautiful, brilliant, redheaded wife, Kathleen. And she helped me tremendously and stuck with me, God knows why, through this terrible period. And I started to come around a bit. But then I went back to Chicago and started classes, and then 2 days later I was riding my bicycle. Some of you know I'm very avid and used to be more militant bicyclist. And I was practicing for a 100-mile ride, and I was 40 miles into a 60-mile ride, and a van ran into me. And I got smashed up really bad, and I was in the hospital for a long time, relatively long time, 2 months to a day. And so then some things that were starting to come apart, you might say, really came apart, but the silver lining there is in a way they started to come apart in a better way. I mean, for one thing, if you're dealing with crazy attachments, then, getting hit in the pelvis by a van that's, where the guy's punching it and then flying through the air and then you slam into the pavement very hard, and broken bones and all that, big hole in my leg, that kind of thing. Nerve damage that I still have, but the silver lining is sort of now things are just going to have to come apart. There's not even any trying to hold them together. As you know, if you've ever spent a long time in the hospital, you have to give up everything. You have to give up embarrassment about your body. You have to give up embarrassment about going to the bathroom. You just can't hang on to any of those things. You just have to let go of all of it, and you really are just putting your hands in other people, and you're going to have somebody come in at 3 in the morning while you're sleeping and pull up your skirt, so to speak, and stick a needle in you, and all these things. And but I tried to take a lesson from it, as they say. And in the midst of that, all of a sudden, to be honest, Buddhism started to make a lot of sense. And it really came together for me in a way that it hadn't before. And now I think I'll just make a long story short and say that, so I did some reading. I read a book by a guy named Brad Warner, who's sometimes called the Punk Zen guy. He had some good instructions about how to practice, how to sit, that made sense to me in ways that my friends were telling me to meditate. It didn't make sense, but this made sense to me. I thought I'd try it. I started to try it, and I've been doing it for 5 years. And when I went back to Chicago after my accident, I began to I joined a Zen temple called Ancient Dragon Zen Gate. I'll just tell one story about that very quickly. Sometimes I run into this redheaded girl in the Starbucks here, and I'm very aware of redheaded people. And later in the day, I saw her in the grocery store with her mother, and so I was chatting amiably with them then. And then a few weeks later, I ran into them at the Wendy's on Ohio, and I was asking this girl if she was in school. It turned out she was a senior in high school. I thought she was in college probably, but I asked her what she was going to do afterward. She said she would probably become a missionary, and that she wanted to be a missionary in China, and that she attends one of our, I think it's called Salina Christian Academy, something like that, so one of our sort of fundamentalist Christian schools. Yeah, I wanted to say, don't go to China, please. Christianity is growing in China. It's an interesting thing. I can tell you about it. I've done a lot of research on it. Talked to a lot of people. We were talking about this and where she went to school and whatnot. And then her mother said, well, as people in Salina will do, said, well, do you have a church home? And so I said, yes, I do. It's called Ancient Dragon Zen Gate in Chicago. Of course, I enjoyed saying that. And she said, oh, is that Buddhist? And I said, yes. And she said, well, do you believe in God? And I said, well, no, not really, not by any definition you would accept. And she said something that often said, well, where do you think everything comes from? And I said, it comes from nowhere. It comes from nothing. Where else could it come from? And I had thought that for a long time, actually. I mean, to me, that just makes absolute sense. Where else could something come from except for from nothing? Because it comes from something. Of course, you're entitled, as Carl Sagan pointed out, to ask, well, where did that come from, et cetera, et cetera. So, but this sort of consolidated that idea for me. And so I found that very helpful. I call it the Wendy's theology. But how do you get from that nothing to the other core value, I think, of Buddhism, to compassion for all sentient beings? I think that's the difficulty. I think more and more, I'd love to hear what other people say about this either today or whenever we can go up to talk. I think there has to be this middle term, maybe, that's something like sympathy or empathy. Certainly, there's this idea in Buddhism of interconnectedness, and that emptiness, in a way, is interconnectedness with no essential terms. And so you get from that this idea that we're all in the same boat. But, from lifeboat ethics and whatnot in the West, there's this idea, well, who do we kick out of the lifeboat, that kind of thing. And so I think we need a little bit more there. So I think there has to be something like sympathy, and then asking, well, what's the basis of that? And something other than just kind of utilitarianism. Oh, well, you're in the same position as me, so I'll help you if you help me, that kind of thing. It's got to be more to it than that, I think. And so, anyway, I'll just end there. Thank you very much for listening.
If anybody has any comments or questions for Bill, I'll pass the microphone around.
Just quickly, I can relate to some degree to what you're saying. I went through my own journey of organized religion and ended up here 17, 18 years ago, whenever. And it came out of allowing myself, my core to emotionally grow up and make my own rules, rather than the organized religion saying, I'll go to hell if I don't do this and this and this. And so this is, of course, enlightening, and I like that quote. The message is, accept yourself and stand on your own 2 feet. And I think if we all could do that, we'd be in a better spot.
I had a chance meeting through my guitar instructor with The Sounds of Silence with Salina and I thought about that several times and got renewed to the lyrics, but it says, "Hello darkness, my old friend, I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping. A vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sounds of silence." I'm going to go on and on. It's worth looking at by itself. But one passage in particular, I think speaks to what you're talking about, Bill. "In the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs with voices never share. No one dare disturb the sounds of silence."
That's a beautiful song. The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls. I mean, one thing I didn't, that's in the big talk, which I can send to you, if anybody wants it, you can get my email address and I'll send it to you. I didn't mention the big influence of John Cage on my life, that I discovered when I was a freshman in college. And of course, silence, for him, silence is just as much a part of music as sound, or darkness, for example. In Buddhism, the dark is not something to be feared or condemned. There isn't that duality of light and dark. I mean, there's light and there's dark, but there's no one is the good and one is evil. And so, for example, I think Buddhism is one of the few religions, and maybe the only, well, I shouldn't say the only, but it's one of the few religions where the moon is just as much a symbol as the sun. I think that's all. It's very interesting. The other thing I was going to say, which I didn't say in the talk, I admit that you begin with it, but is that the role of the Beatles in everything. I mean, in a way, I just think more and more that almost everything that's important to me in one way or another came out of the Beatles or came through the Beatles. And that includes, John Cage and John Coltrane and all of that. And so, and the Sound of Silence.
Something you said at the beginning of your presentation and something you said at the end kind of connect for me. And maybe that's what you intended. But at the beginning you made a comment about some of the new atheists and some of the arguments that you hear from those folks. And then at the end you talked about something from nothing. And what else could it be? And it strikes me that in some of those arguments that you hear from the anti-religion, the anti-God arguments, to argue against something, you have to have a definition of what that is. And I think it's interesting that when you look at that, you find them defining the divine in a very similar way to what the very fundamentalist, very basic, very literal interpretation of what the divine might be. In other words, they kind of set up a straw man and then proceed to demolish it. And I think that if you look at things in a broader sense, in the something from nothing kind of category, it's hard to argue against something or something that you really don't understand and can't put together in your own head. And so to me that resonated a little bit. It just we don't know, we don't understand, and I think it's important to start from that basis when you embark on a spiritual journey.
Well, yeah, and I think one thing that's missing from the new atheists is that they don't really have a feel for what you might call the attitude of the seeker. And I don't just mean a religious or a spiritual seeker, but any kind of seeker. Because it seems to me people also come to science with that attitude. But somehow they don't. I guess another thing that sort of speaks to that is that there's a saying that some of my favorite Zen people like to say that Zen doesn't answer your questions, it questions your answers. And these are some of the new atheists. I don't really think have much of a feel for that kind of attitude or approach to it.
Okay, Bill, I think that's all the questions we have for right now. And it's time. Thank you very much.